So my name is Edward Roske. Apparently I've forgotten to introduce myself in most of the other sessions that I've done. I'm CEO at Interol. I've been involved in this world since the mid-1990s. As Glenn Schwartzer likes to put it, I am a dinosaur in the Essbase world, but I am here to impart something old that is now new again, which is Essbase calc scripts. For the longest time, the only people writing calculations in Essbase were people who had been doing it for a long time. They had been phasing it out, trying to go things with more of a graphical interface, trying to build more into the product, and then lo and behold, with the new cloud products, to give the ability to customize the built-in calculations, all of a sudden we have a brand new world of people going and writing Essbase calcs. In some cases, it's people who had experience with HFM, had been writing hs.exp custom formulas, custom calculations for a while, and they said Essbase doesn't in any way line up with the HFM world. So I'm going to attempt to teach all of you HFM people, you non-Essbase people, everything about calc scripts. If you already know anything about calc scripts, I'm going to reset everything that you've learned. If you find any of this information useful, please tweet it out to the world. Share it with the world, tag me, I will retweet it. I'm a big believer in learning things and passing it on. That's why I'm here. This is a passion of mine to educate all of you. We're gonna get started because we have 105 slides to cover. Don't panic. About 40 of them are appendix information. I am going to post the full deck online. So for instance, I'm going to give you a couple of slides on blocks and what that means. But really, it takes about 20 slides to explain it. They're all going to be in the deck. And at the very end, I'm going to give you continuing education, places to go to continue on your educational journey. Everybody ready? Let's do this. So FCCS is really the new one to the EPM family to use Essbase behind the scenes, because FCCS is not HFM on the cloud. HFM is a relational backend. It predominantly uses VB script. The type of customization you're allowed to do is more constrained than it is in an Essbase world, but they figured out a way to constrain it even more by going to FCCS. Now here's the good news. FCCS, just like PBCS, has Essbase on the back end. Here's the even better news. A lot of stuff we used to have to custom code in HFM, things like roll forwards, feeding over to the cash flow, CTA, that is all built in to FCCS. So for the first year and a half or so, there was really no good way to customize the calculations beyond very specific templates or formulas within FCCS. We couldn't go off and write a completely brand new calculation. But since we have Essbase on the back end, we know it was only a matter of time till we could do that. PBCS, on the other hand, really is the cloud evolution of Hyperion planning, which always sat on top of Essbase, always allowed us to have the ability to do custom calculations. They've just improved the interface. They focus much more on Calculation Manager when they got up to the cloud. I didn't bother listing up ePBCS. It's a little different what you can customize, but the fundamentals of writing a calculation, the type of commands you need, how blocks work, it applies across the board, no matter which of the cloud products you're working. You can even do things, for instance, in TRCS. It's a little bit different in profitability and cost management because that's more ASO, but you can also write calculations over there. But the great news across all these products is the greatest technology on earth, in my humble opinion, Essbase, is behind all of them. So we have the most scalable multidimensional technology on earth, a way to take all that flat relational data and make it something easy to spin around, easy to put stuff in the rows and stuff in the columns. Now, traditionally, products like an HFM have used relational databases. That's because they focused more on the transactions. They wanted you to store almost at the debit credit level, the trial balance level. Well, the thing about a relational database, it's not terribly good at summarizing. It's really bad at pivoting and spinning that information around. So when they made the jump to the cloud, they said, we've realized that modern day financial close is much more top-down information, much more kind of spinning things around, so we're gonna use Essbase as that foundation. So we now have that great way to group things. We have built-in hierarchy versus in a relational database, a hierarchy is an afterthought. We have that data stored in a way that makes it super fast for analysis and reporting. We can do aggregate storage. We can do block storage. Underneath the current cloud applications, we are going to be able to do hybrid. We have this really powerful calculation engine with hundreds of calculations out there. We can get secure down to the individual cell level. So what this means is we have to understand Essbase. We can't just say, well, let's focus on the front end and let's let the back end take care of itself. PBCS, we have a lot more control. FCCS at the moment is much more locked down. They control, for instance, your density and sparsity for you. They control what areas you're allowed to insert a calculation point. But you still have to understand the technologies. Especially on the PBCS side, you have to understand when it makes sense to use block storage, which is most of what I'm going to talk about today, or when it makes sense to use aggregate storage, or when it makes sense to kind of use the two together, which, again, it's harder in PBCS and FCCS. Yes, Glenn Schwartzberg, do you want me to give you a mic so you can just add pithy comments periodically?
I know, I'm just curious how many people in the room are FCCS?
That is an excellent question. Okay, that was pithy, so this was pithy but valuable. So I'm going to ask two questions, and you can raise your hand for both of them. How many people in the room are PBCS customers or implementers or going to it? Okay, drop your hands. How about the same question for FCCS? How many people are using it? Okay, there is a couple of people overlapping. It looks like roughly 2/3 of you are PBCS, about a quarter of you are FCCS, and the other ones didn't raise your hand. But that's cool. Maybe you just want to learn in general, one day hoping to implement this. So on the PBCS side, you can do both block storage and aggregate storage. ASO is what they're going to use under PCMCS. Block storage is predominantly what they're going to use under FCCS. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a bit. We'll also have to talk about dense and sparseness, basically what makes up a block, what makes up an index pointer to that block. We're going to talk about some insanity with creating blocks. You are totally going to add pithy comments during my entire session. This is going to be awesome. You get two presenters for the price of one. So we're going to talk about ways to create blocks. I can't go into it in detail, but I'll give you one slide on it. We're going to talk about how the syntax works in BSO. We're not going to have time to cover the ASO syntax. It is fundamentally different and very, very hard. So it's important to either use block storage or coming in the future being able to use hybrid under these applications. A lot of the functions work in both member formulas and business rules. Most of the commands will only work inside of business rules, calculation scripts that you're generating. So we're going to talk about how those calculation manager business rules, how the syntax differs, how there are some more powerful commands you can run inside of those. Time permitting, if we don't get to it, I have the slides in here. We're going to talk about what's delivered out of the box. Some things are canned. You can't touch them at all in PBCS and FCCS. Some of the things are actually meant to be customized, some through templates, some through not. And some you have to just generate yourself entirely brand new. But here's the good news. If you know calculations, you not only know Essbase standalone, you now know how to write custom calculations in PBCS and custom calculations in FCCS and TRCS and all the other products that are out there, because all of them sit on that Essbase backend. So even though I've been telling people for 5 to 10 years, don't bother learning this, just learn how to maintain existing scripts, I retract that. You all should be adding this to your tool set, just like you should be getting really good at SmartView and FDME, because those are strategic products. Get really good at the calc script side. So I'm going to attempt to condense a 2-day class down to 26 minutes. And then I'll tell you at the end, if you're curious, where you can go to get the much longer version of all this. So the place we're going to be doing our editing with our cloud products is up in Calculation Manager. And it comes with PBCS, FCCS, and the rest. So when you need to create a new rule, you're going to be doing it in Calculation Manager when you're creating one of these scripts, either graphically or otherwise, to control the application. Now, most people think of Calculation Manager as a place to do a flow chart of your calculation. Basically, start here, do these things, branch off, come back, loop a few times, and finish. But you also have that ability to just script it entirely. Where you can actually just create all the text, you can go type it all in, it nicely codes it for you so that you can see what it is you're going to be doing. Calculation Manager, it gives you a lot of power. It's not just the built-in little template snippets that it lets you grab. You can do things like use variables. You can share different rules. So you can have one rule, maybe to do an allocation, you want to use it in a different application, you can carry that template rule across. So the rules or components within the rules can be shared. It gives you a nice little tree kind of hierarchy to see it all in. For a reason I am still boggled by, whether it's FCCS or PBCS, they show up under planning. My best speculation on this, by the way, is that FCCS is essentially built on the PBCS framework. that they leverage all the effort that went into PBCS, and they just kind of made their own consolidation framework and rules on top of it. So don't get thrown. So when you go in, you're going to see planning up there. There's also a lot of things you can do. You can open up scripts, you can debug them, you can edit, you can delete, refresh, view, import, export, all from Calculation Manager. You can print out your rules, you can delete them, you can share them with other people, you can create shortcuts to them. The interface in Calculation Manager is actually pretty straightforward. If you look up in the top left where it says A, that's where we see our predefined objects. So up in that section, if you don't want to write a script manually, no problem at all. This is how you drag and drop it. So you start up there and drag it across. There is a component that says script that we'll cover in a second that will show you how you can just type in text if you want. That toolbar / menu bar, it's kind of a combination of the two. That's where we can save as, we can validate our rules, debug, analyze, deploy. That happens up in section B. Down over there in section C, that's the system objects. This is where we put the components that we want to reuse in other scripts. Section D is what most people tend to think of when they see Calculation Manager. That's the data flow. That's the visual idea of where our data is coming across. You can also add captions and things, make it easier to understand what's happening up there. Section E is where a lot of the editing, a lot of the control, a lot of the templates happen to change the properties of what you're looking at. I'm sorry, the overall view of what you're looking at. Over there in section F, these are the detailed properties of whatever you have clicked on. So when in doubt, refer back to that screen. That'll tell you everything you want to know. Now, there are a couple of different ways you can create rules, and there are a couple of different ways you can edit rules. The two predominant ways are graphical mode. And when I say two predominant ways, there's kind of a third one, which is Groovy now shows up in Calculation Manager. Way to go, Joe Altman. Yes, one of our biggest Groovy fans. We're not going to talk about Groovy. Sorry, now he's walking out. So we're going to talk.
Edward, only in ePBCS.
What was that?
Only in ePBCS.
Oh, excellent point. So Groovy is a way of doing more programmatic control, so even beyond calculations. It's a full-blown programming language. At the moment, that is exposed in ePBCS only. But we're going to talk about graphical and script mode. So graphical mode is the flowchart method. Yes, Joe Altman? I should give you a microphone, too. Oh, excellent point. I didn't really want to go into it, but since you shouted it out from the back of the room. So Groovy is that full programmatic language, and I just now said it's only there in ePBCS, which is the built-in frameworks. There is another way to buy PBCS where you buy just one of the frameworks. It's called PBCS plus one. In PBCS plus one, it would also be there in the Groovy world. So basically just not there in straight full, normal PBCS, but anytime you add the frameworks on top, you'll get Groovy. So graphical mode is probably where you're going to start. Now behind the scenes, graphical mode is actually generating script for you because that's the language that Essbase knows how to speak. So if you want, you can do the kind of more powerful side. I'm going to work, I'm basically going to void the warranty and do it all on my own. That's your script mode. So if you look up there, it's pretty easy. I begin, I do some setting, there might be other steps. I fix, I calculate, I do an if statement, and then I end. Down below, we're in completely open Essbase Calc language. Calc dim, ag, that's actually what I did to replace a Calc all script. So instead of doing calculate the whole database, which is pretty inefficient because a lot of those dimensions didn't need calculating, I told it go ahead and calc the account dimension, then aggregate the entity and the product dimension. So the graphical mode, it's not just about dragging in high-level versions of functions. You can actually drag in full-blown templates. So for instance, if I want to do a driver calculation, I want to do an allocation, or I want to copy, or I want to clear data, there are actually templates built for all those. And if I drag them up, it's going to be a whole section of calculations behind the scenes. One of the fun ones is actually the set commands. There are, 30 different set commands that control how your calculation script operates. It's kind of difficult to remember all of them and remember when they're used. The set command wizard kind of template walks you through all the set commands and tells you exactly what arguments to put in. You can decide which ones you want to use. So even you more experienced Essbase Calc people in the room, it's kind of fun to play around with the set command one. It's just a faster way to get your script started. So how does this all look? Now, admittedly, this is a slightly older interface. It changes like every fourth Friday when I log in. So I'm going up to Calculation Manager, going into Planning, going into Vision, looking under Sales. I'm going to right-click and say New. I'm going to give it a name. How about Calc Alt? Notice I'm controlling it with my mind. It could be Planning, could be Direct Essbase. There's my application. There's my cube. Might be something like FCCS out there. Notice it starts off doing virtually nothing. It just has begin and end. But here's this fun set command wizard. So when I pull this in, notice it's going to appear down there in half a second. So it nicely groups them and says, well, we're going to start by doing things related to data volumes. You know, do we want to be updating our dirty blocks? How do we want to deal with empty sets? Do we want to change how we handle really complex formulas? What about when we clear, when we actually create blocks? When we operate on remote transparent partitions? What are we going to do with our cache settings and our block settings? How are we going to handle our various memory usages? Eventually, I get all the way to the end. This is Calc parallel, Calc task-dims. At some point, I click on Save. Notice the wizard data was updated. So at this point, I finish. And what it's actually doing is putting in, if I click on Script, the only one I actually filled in was set update calc. That's basically the one that says ignore dirty blocks that are out there, just operate on everything in the entire application. So as you can see, you don't need to know the script it's generating. You're just going through the wizard, and it's giving you nice, handy descriptions of what each function does while it puts it in behind the scenes. Now what we can do is kind of as a bridge into the scripting world is we can start off with a graphical rule, but we can add a script component. So we can say add this one on down. So maybe I want to do my own little narrowing portion. I don't want to operate on the whole cube. I want to operate just on forecast. And maybe I want to calculate my old units, up them 50% and put the new amount into the new units. And maybe I want to do that for a few different accounts out there and then be done. I can go ahead and type that in. Now when you're actually generating a script, there are a few kind of syntax rules to keep in mind. First of all, this isn't actually listed, but the formatting that you tend to see, like over there to the right, you notice the interior stuff is kind of indented. That is just convention. Spaces are not relevant at all. It kind of ignores them. It ignores tabs that it sees in the script. This is really so we can kind of tell what it's narrowing. So you'll see that happen a lot with fixed statements. People tend to indent the stuff that's in the kind of narrowing focus calculation. They'll indent stuff that's inside of an if. If a function wraps to multiple lines, people will tend to take the second line and stick it in. So it doesn't care about spaces. It also doesn't particularly care about case in 99.999% of cases. Now, in general, when in doubt, end every line that you have in a script with a semicolon. They are not necessarily required. For instance, if you look at the end of the fixed statement, there's not a semicolon, but lines 3, 6, 7, 8, there are, and then there's not at the end of 10. It would really hurt nothing if I tossed an extra semicolon out there. It means basically this statement is complete. The reason that it has you do a semicolon as opposed to just a carriage return is sometimes your statement will be so long. You know, you're doing a formula that's like 1,000 characters. You don't want to have to keep scrolling all the way over to see what it does. You want to do the first part of the function, then go to the next line, do the next part, next line, do the next part. The way to kind of tell it that you've completed is not a carriage return, it's a semicolon. There are several cases where your member name has to have double quotes around it. If it has a space, if it contains a non-alphanumeric character like a plus or a minus, if it starts with a number, if it's a reserved word. When in doubt, and matter of fact, just all the time, put double quotes around any member name. So anytime you're referring to a specific name or description, it could be an alias too, name or description out of the cube, put it in double quotes. That way, number one, you don't have to worry about what takes quotes and doesn't. Number two, which is even cooler, it color codes it correctly. So within the system, in my case, it's a little hard to tell, but it's actually putting everything it sees in double quotes in kind of a purple. Some people have it do it in a gray or kind of a black. It doesn't know how to process things that aren't in the double quotes. So putting in the double quotes makes it easier to see. In general, spaces don't matter at all unless it's in a member name. So in a member name, put it in double quotes. Comments can be multiple lines. So in my case, my comments are one line, but you can span it. You start a comment. What language is this from? I can't remember. What is it? Is it C? Yeah, it was either C or Pascal. It's been so long since I've written it. So you do a slash and a star, then your comment can go on 15 lines, end it with a star and a slash. And then finally, the commands, even though you'll tend to see them in all caps. So like you see, I put fix in all caps. I put set update calc in all caps, calc dim, ag, and end fix in all caps. Again, that's pure convention. It makes it real easy to spot what's a function or a command. If it was in kind of a proper case or lowercase, it might look too much to me like a member name. So I put it all together under one nice script writing rules, And there are some other very esoteric things that you don't have to worry about right now. So what if I actually wanted to do one of these scripts? So in this case, I'm going to drag the script component across. And at this point, I'm working without a net. Notice it doesn't pop up a nice wizard. It just gives me a place to start typing something. So I'm going to tell it calcdim. And calcdim means aggregate a dimension. It's most often used for dense dimensions. So I'm going to calcdim account, because account is dense. It's always dense in FCCS. It may or may not be in PBCS.
What's a dense?
What was that?
What's a dense?
We're going to cover that in a second, Glenn Schwartzberg. Then I'm going to aggregate a sparse dimension, which we will also cover in a second. So we're going to aggregate entity, and we're going to aggregate product. Now I have this nice code snippet. If I ever want to aggregate my whole cube, I could actually go save this off as a brief template, as a component. I could run it whenever I want to. I clicked on the validate button. It let me know I'm a good human being. No syntax errors have been found. Pretty sure that means I get into heaven. If I want to see the whole thing, basically the parts that it did at the set, and there were some things that were already happening. It's like, where did the fix come from? That fix is the way to narrowly focus your calculation. That was actually added way back there at the beginning portion. So by typing in just 3 lines of a script, I actually have something that works on the whole cube, because I told it to not pay attention to whether a block is recently loaded, calculated or not. I said ignore the dirty blocks, operate on the whole thing. I focus on just a portion, just the base data of the application. I did that in the beginning. And then I ran this script to basically aggregate the entire cube, which is an excellent segue into Glenn Schwartzberg's question, what is dense, what is sparse, what are blocks? Now, for the most part, we don't need to care about this if we're back in a relational world. So, for instance, we're back in HFM. But it's very, very important to Essbase, because it controls how data is not only stored, how it's retrieved, how it's calculated. Basically, everything around data in a block storage cube is controlled by this dense sparse concept. So dense data is data that occurs a lot. Quite simply, dense data is more dense. So for instance, if you think of a time dimension, well, if I load data for a given account to January, I'm probably also going to load data to that account in February, especially if it's a balance sheet. Then I'm going to load it in March, I'm going to load it in April, I'm probably going to load it throughout the whole year. Now, it's not necessarily every account. You might have an account titled, I don't know, money I'm hiding offshore. That might be an end of the year kind of thing. But for the most part, it's going to repeat. So time and accounts are most likely going to be filled in. So if you look in the bottom right, if you think of measures down the side and time across the top, most of the intersections of those 2 dimensions are going to be filled. Not necessarily, especially if we have a really large chart of accounts, or if it's an income statement with 17,000 accounts in it, we might kind of be variable about which ones we use. So those are dense dimensions that we tend to have most of those combinations. Sparse, quite simply, it's the opposite. It's the things that aren't as common. So for instance, we're a retail company, and we sell lots of products around the world. We have stores in Alaska, we also have stores in Florida. Well, let's say our products go everywhere from air conditioning units to bikinis. Well, I'm probably not selling a ton of bikinis in Alaska. I don't know, I just stereotyped Alaskans as not wearing bikinis. So I'm not selling a lot of that product up there, and I'm probably also not selling a lot of air conditioning up there. But down here in Florida, I'm selling a lot of swimsuits, I'm selling a lot of air conditioning. On the other hand, heavy winter coats, probably selling up a lot more in Alaska, but not down here. So those intersection of those 2 dimensions tend to be pretty uncommon. I'm not selling all 100,000 SKUs at my company across all 1,000 locations. So that is sparse data. Examples of dimensions that tend, when you put them on the axes, not to have a lot of intersections: products, markets, employees. If I have 100,000 employees in my company, they don't work at every location. I've got maybe 10 or 100 of them at any given spot, so the intersection of those tends to be pretty sparse. Now, this is important because every time I pull up a block, and a block is made up of the dense dimensions. So when I pull up an intersection of this product for this store, so maybe it's air conditioning units in Orlando, when I pull up that, it will load all the accounts and all the time periods for that intersection. So the way the calculations work is, by default, it's not going to look at blocks that don't exist, because it knows most combinations of those sparse dimensions are not present. We don't have to load up by every employee, by every market, by every product. That's a very unlikely combination to exist. So the first thing it's going to do is go to the index, and it's going to say, what blocks are there? So if you go back to this last one, what intersections actually exist? Well, those intersections, those pointers, exist in a file called the index, or several index files. Now, we don't have to tell it which blocks those are. We don't have to say, oh, go grab this intersection, this one, and this one. We just simply tell the database, operate on all the blocks that you can find. So we don't have to loop through it. There's no whiling or for nexting that we have to do. Now, when that index finds a block and says, okay, I know where the blocks are, I know it's time to calculate this block, that index file points to a page file where all the data is stored, loads in an entire block of information. So it loads in by every measure, by every time. We would sometimes, for instance, might see like a scenario dimension as dense. So scenario would be actual and budget. So that block would be every account, every time period for actual and budget. It would load all into memory for me. So where are the actual values stored? They're stored at the intersection of that block. So if you think of it like a Rubik's Cube, the numbers are stored on the little colored pieces on the outside. It doesn't matter how I turn that thing around, it's always that same set of numbers that's stored out there.
In PBCS and ePBCS, you can decide what you want as dense and sparse. In FCCS, you only get one dimension that's dense, and that's the accounts dimension.
Yeah, we have much more flexibility, like I said, on the PBCS side. The thing about financial consolidation, it's much more of a command control, strict accounting rules. They're also trying to control kind of the performance and do a lot more for you. So in FCCS, we don't have the flexibility to change around the sparsity, at least at the moment. Any dimension but accounts is going to be sparse. So they don't really have a block. They more like have a line, like a Rubik's snake, if you ever saw one of those, just a series of values all the way across. And the pointer just says load in all the whole accounts dimension for that intersection. So there are several ways you can do a calculation in Essbase, therefore in PBCS, PBCS plus 1, ePBCS, FCCS. The most common way, and this I'm not going to teach you about because we're pretty comfortable with it, is just outline consolidation. The pluses, the minuses, the times, the multiplies, the various other kind of single unary operators as you aggregate up your outline. Just about every one of the applications will at some point calculate your cube, and it will roll up based on all those pluses and minuses. The one that most people will start kind of customizing with are the member formulas. Now in ePBCS, in FCCS, you will see a lot of pre-built calculations where they have a member, and it's probably dynamic, and there'll be a formula with it that will tell you how that member actually is going to calculate. I encourage you to look at those formulas for ideas. I do not encourage you to copy them, particularly on FCCS. They're badly written. If anybody in here is with FCCS, I volunteered 700 times to optimize your calcs for you. But at least you will learn syntax, because the syntax is correct. It's just nothing you should directly copy. On PBCS, or ePBCS, it's more kind of the ratio side, and it's totally fine. So member formulas are kind of one-off. So for calculating things like gross margin percentage, net income percentage, things that cannot be done through outline consolidation. If it can be done through outline consolidation, and generally you want to, because Essbase is really damn good at aggregating things, whether it's plus or minus up the hierarchy. It's been optimized since like 1992. Business rules are a more complicated collection of all of these, and I'm going to cover the syntax for both formulas and business rules in a second, so we can talk about how we actually aggregate all these up. And there are a few other reasons to use member formulas that are out there. Member formula is where I'm going to start. Now, the syntax is slightly different between a calculation script, business rule, and a formula. Member formulas, generally, you have one thing on the left-hand side of the equals. That's whatever member it is you're trying to calculate, like gross margin percentage. You generally have one thing over there on the right, which is what you want to calculate, like a numerator or denominator. It can get fairly complicated, but you're not doing things like looping logic, clearing, copying, setting up temporary variables. For that, you're going to need the greater complexity. So member formulas are really simple. They're easy to see. You can now see them in things like forms. You can see them in SmartView to show how that member actually gets calculated. We'll talk in a second about fix. Fix is a way to focus down your calculation, to be able to say, I don't want to operate on the whole cube, maybe I just want it to operate on forecast, and I only want it to operate on forecast for next year. Member formulas, that formula exists for the whole database, basically for the whole Essbase cube. You would actually have to add if logic into the formula to say only make that formula work on forecast or only make it work on next year. So when I add a formula to gross margin percentage that says gross margin divided by revenue, semicolon, that formula I just added exists for every intersection of every sparse dimension in the entire application and every dense dimension except accounts. So rules are for our more complicated things. We want to do allocations, we want to do depreciation, we want to do constant looping and iterating to maybe keep allocating till all of our numbers are fully set out. Calculations, business rules also give us a way to override the default order, because there's a certain order, which I'm not going to cover, in terms of how Essbase aggregates its dimensions, how it calculates its formulas. Calculation scripts, rules, let us override that order. One of the great reasons to use rules is if I want to copy data from one place to another, or copying it from one cube to another place. If a member has a formula on it, you can call that member. It will evaluate that formula in your calculation script. You can also, if it's a stored member, overwrite the formula that's on that member. So you can make it calc slightly differently within your script. So business rules are definitely more powerful. But if you can, your priority order should always be outline, followed by a member formula. If you can put it on that formula, you write it once, you never have to worry about it again. If you put it into a business rule, that calculation only gets executed if you run the business rule. So if you say, for instance, gross margin percent equals gross margin divided by revenue, and you don't put it on a formula, you toss that in a script, it will only calculate gross margin percentage if you run the script, and then it will store it. Instead, I could put it as a formula and make it more dynamic. But there are a whole lot of good reasons. Maybe I don't want to calculate the whole database. Well, then I'd use a business rule. Maybe I want to do some different currency conversion that actually comes standard outside the box. I could do it. Maybe I want to do price volume exchange calculations. Maybe I want to do constant currency and look at all my fluctuating currency rates. Maybe I don't like how the formula is written generally. I want to do something specific. Like maybe I use the internal rate of return function for looking at his history, but I want to use a slightly different version that we wrote ourselves for IRR going forward. Maybe I want to do multiple passes through the application, clearing data, copying data. You can even, if your calculation is really, really complicated, you can not only set up variables in a script, you can actually set up an entire array of variables where you can say create a variable for every month in my time dimension or every location in my entire market dimension. So syntax-wise, we're going to skip all those. We're going to jump to calc script commands. There are several different types of calc script commands. Now, for the most part, with a slight exception of ifs, these are not going to be used inside of a formula. These are going to be used inside of one of those scripts I create. So there are some things where you're just doing some housekeeping, or where you're doing the set commands that I showed you before. Basically things that kind of control how the overall calculation operates, controls how it cleans up the index, and a few other functions. We can do some roll-up calculations. We can tell it how to aggregate various dimensions. One of the really important calc script commands, the way you can tell a command is generally it doesn't start with an @ sign. Functions start with @ signs, commands tend not to. One of the really cool things you can do with a command is you can narrow your calc down. So instead of saying operate on all the accounts or operate on all the entities, I could say focus on this specific entity or focus on this specific time period, or only focus on next year. We can also do very specific calculation commands that are kind of one-off, and I'm not really going to cover those. There's a powerful data copy command that will take data from one section, send it over somewhere else. And then there are also a couple different ways to clear data. You can actually clear cells out of a block, or you can just clear the entire existence of the block. There's a great command. I'm going to give you, by the way, a list in a second of 27 commands you should learn. And if you don't want to learn all 224, I'll show you the 27 you should actually start with. But one of the powerful ones you can learn is called clear block. All it does is, remember there's that index file that points to a series of blocks? Rather than load the block into memory, blank every one of the cells out, and write that back out, the clear block command says just forget that block exists. Just forget the index pointer. Think of how much faster that is. Don't read the whole thing into memory, just forget its existence. And then Essbase is smart enough to kind of clean up that space and reuse those open spots. So roll-up commands, these are the ones you're going to see most often. I just showed you examples of them. Calc all, when in doubt, it's going to do everything. It's going to aggregate your whole database, calculate your dense dimensions, your sparse dimensions, everything that's out there. But what if you want to target it? Or what if you can't use calc all? So like on FCCS, there are several dimensions pre-specified for you that you cannot override, and I'll show you what those are in a second. You can't calculate the whole database because only, I think, 5 of your dimensions are left for you to play with. You're going to need to use calc dim. So calc dim will aggregate both dense dimensions and sparse dimensions. It will also calculate any formulas that are out there. Ag specifically is going to work with sparse dimensions. It's faster. In general, it doesn't look for formulas. It basically just is everything that's in the outline consolidation. So if it's a sparse dimension, I'm probably using ag. If it's a dense dimension, I'm probably using calc dim. CalcDim, like I said, will work on sparse. The other way around is not true. Ag won't work on dense dimensions. So let's start with these focusing ones, because these are really the coolest ones. So let's say I'm trying to calculate just my rolling forecast, and my rolling forecast goes for the rest of this year and next year. Well, by default, the calculation might do all the time periods or go beyond the end of where my rolling forecast is. So maybe I want to tell it focus just on those time periods, or focus just on a specific entity, or focus just in FCCS, maybe just on the input currency or just on the parent currency. The three commands that we predominantly use to focus not on the whole thing but narrow down to a specific spot: fix followed by nfix, and I'll have a slide to show you that in a second, isolates your everything between the fix and the nfix down to a small portion of your calculation. If is a way to say, if I'm on this member, if this thing is happening, go calculate this. Else, if this is happening, go calculate this. Else, if this is happening, go calculate this, and an end if. Fix, nfix, and if, end if are considered to be sandwich commands. Every fix ends with an nfix. Every if ends with an end if. There's also a cross-dim operator that I'll explain in a second, which basically says, if I'm over here in this portion of the cube, go point to that other portion. There's some value I want elsewhere. So even though you're calculating maybe 2017, I want you to go get the December 2016 value. So go get my last year's number, go pull it across. So fix is a subset of the database. Predominantly, you're going to use this on sparse dimensions. You do not have to. There are actually certain cases where it's really fast to fix on a couple of dense dimensions, provided you're doing it all at once. So fix in general is going to be on things like market time or employees, but let's say I wanted to blank out 25 of the accounts in FCCS. I could actually fix on those 25, because it's not always fix plus a single member. It could be fix plus a series of members out there. Just remember that every fix ends with an end fix. Everything it does in the middle is going to calculate kind of all at once. It's going to do it in that order, but until it gets down to the end fix, it's going to ignore all the other blocks that are out there. Again, end fixes don't require a semicolon, just like fixes don't, but when in doubt, if you don't want to remember the esoteric exceptions, just semicolon to your heart's content. So here's an example. Maybe I wanted to aggregate my measures dimension, my product dimension, and my market dimension. I wanted to do it all at once. I don't care if it's fast, but I don't want you to aggregate budget right now. We just closed our books. We just loaded in actual information. So how can I tell it just calculate actual? The syntax is really simple. Fix, parenthesis, actual, parenthesis. Then I do my calc dim on measures, product, and market. And now at this point, I'm doing an end fix. Now, if there's a dimension I didn't specify, so notice I didn't specify a time period. What that means is it's going to operate on all the time periods that are out there. So I didn't tell it a specific month. I didn't tell it a specific year that I'm looking at. Anything I leave out, it's going to iterate through that whole section of the database. So let's talk about if and end if. If is a conditional test. Basically, is this condition true? If so, do the stuff within it. Technically, the stuff in there is returning a 1 if it's true, a 0 if it's false, but it's really trying to say, don't operate on everything. Only when this happens, do the portion between it. Now, the key thing to remember about if is that it ends in an end if, and the syntax is a little weird for an if. So if you went to my session that Glenn and I did yesterday, we explained why this syntax is weird, but an if inside of a member formula, you just start typing, if, parenthesis, is member east, parenthesis, do this. An if inside of a calc script has to be attached to a member. That's because if only can work inside of a member formula. So what I have to do is temporarily assign a formula to a member. So in my case, I'm trying to focus on market, and I'm trying to change their payroll. I'm basically saying if you're in the east, you get a 10% raise. If you're in the west or the south, you get a 15% raise. If you're in one of the other areas, sorry, you only get a 5% raise. So in an actual member formula, I wouldn't have to put in the market paren and the paren down at the bottom, but inside of a calc script, I have to assign that if to a member. Basically, I have to give it a temporary formula. So I'm going to tell it market at the top. The other way to focus a calculation is through a cross dim. The cross dim is this really cool character. It's an arrow right there. The way you type it in an arrow is you do a dash and a greater than symbol. If you look all around, you keep hitting the right arrow, that does not work. It's literally just two characters they typed in next to each other that kind of look like it's pointing that way. So you use this to say if I'm calculating maybe something over in the east, but I need a value from the west, I would say cross dim, so that way, and then greater than symbol over to the west to go get its value. So for instance, maybe I want to calculate margin, but we have a standard margin across all of our products, or a standard cost of goods sold. I don't load cost of goods sold by individual products. So even though I'm down there at the individual SKU, even though I have sales at the individual SKU, to get the COGS, the cost of goods sold value, I'm going to need to point up to the top of the product dimension, because it's not by SKU. So go up to the top and grab total product. So if you'll notice, that little cross-dimmy thing over there to the right, so margin equals sales minus COGS cross-dim over to product. Now that would also work inside of a function, so I could just do margin equals sales minus COGS cross-dim product. We can also do very specific multiply, divide, plus, minus, various functions that are out there. We can say, for instance, something equals charges divided by units, salaries equal FTEs times average HR times some rate, cost equals this. By the way, these are not totally valid. I'd be putting double quotes around the member names, but it gives you an idea of some of the types of things you could do. By the way, that thing starting with an @ symbol, that's a function. I'm going to cover those in just a second. A couple of the other commands that are really helpful, clear data. You can clear either a specific name or you can do a combination. So it could be, instead of just saying clear data budget, it could be clear data budget cross dim to the west. And that would just blank out the west portion of the budget. Data copy says copy it from either one member name or a combination using that cross dim. So one member name or one section of the database over to another one. So if I said data copy actual to budget, it's going to take the current year actual and replace the current year budget for it. If on the other hand I said data copy actual cross dim 2017 to budget cross dim 2018, it's going to copy last year's actual to this year's budget. Notice I'm not specifying any other dimensions though. So if I say copy actual to budget, I didn't have to tell it the time periods, the scenarios, the entities, the products, the markets, anything like that. Anything I don't specify, it's going to do it for everything. So calc commands are very, very powerful. They tend to operate on large swaths of the database. Functions are much more specific, and there are a whole lot of them. Just some of the categories. Conditionals, these are things that tend to return true, or I'm sorry, they are kind of comparison operators. Booleans tend to return true and false. Relationships kind of go up and down the hierarchy. My normal rule of thumb is if you can do it in Excel, you can do it in Essbase plus some. For instance, Excel, say you had a bunch of accounts and you had a total down at the bottom. And you were on one of those accounts and you said, I want to know what the parent account is. Excel doesn't know that. Even though you have a sum formula at the bottom, it doesn't know that these really roll into this. But those hierarchy functions, those relationship functions do exist in Essbase. So I can tell it, go up to the parent, tell me who the parent value is. Now you can go out to the technical reference for all the calc functions and commands. There are, I pulled it into Excel just so I can give you a number, 224. That's what most people would say the total is. Oracle Marketing somehow says over 300. Some of the functions do a couple different flavors, I think is how they get to that number. So the Essbase technical reference is where you go for all your official documentation. While I love the technical reference as a starting point, the biggest problem with it is a lot of the examples aren't terribly good. Some of them date back literally 25 years and they haven't been updated. So while I'm telling you to go use the tech ref, I'm actually going to direct you somewhere else. So the tech ref is the official documentation. You can start there. But I encourage you wholly to go to my labor of love, epm.bi/videos. Glenn Schwartzberg and I are devoting all of our free time, and we actually have no lives, so we have a lot of free time, to converting the entire Essbase technical reference to videos. These videos have the most correct information we can come up with. We've tested, we have years of experience. We also have more realistic examples. Because no one's paying us to do this, it's taking us a really long time. So we've gotten about 50 of the functions up there, but the really common ones. We also do videos on like how to write calc scripts, when to use clear block versus clear data, when to use if versus fix. By the way, if you ever hear anyone say fix on sparse, if on dense, they are oversimplifying a ton to get down to that statement. There are a lot of reasons why that statement isn't true. So if you want to find out what some of those are, epm.bi/videos. By the way, no marketing out there at all. It just takes you to our YouTube page. So I know we have a lot of consultants in the room. Use that. And tell your customers use it. Except for an Interroll logo watermarked in the corner, you wouldn't even know it was Interroll out there. So functions in general are going to appear on the right side of an equals. They don't have to. Functions can also be nested inside of functions. So you can say grab the current member and then go to the parent of the current member. The functions are easy to spot because they're all started with an at. They will have generally lots and lots of parameters. So it might be, for instance, go up to the ancestor in this dimension and go up this many generations, go up this high in the hierarchy. So you're going to tend to see it on the right side of an equals. It is not always true. Member functions that return a single member name you can use on the left side of an equals. You can also use functions inside of fixed statements. You can inside of if statements. You can use them in data copies and clears, provided they resolve to a specific member name. So now here is the most helpful slide. If you're going to take a picture of one slide, it's this next one. You're like, well, you could have let us sleep for the last 45 minutes. These are, yeah, you've already been sleeping for the last 45 minutes. Wait till I expand the whole thing. These are the 27 of the 224 that you will use 90% of the time. They let you do things like go up in the hierarchy, go down to the children, count the number of members. I want to go make new blocks because I don't just want to operate on the existing one. I want to go create new ones. I want to understand the member I'm on. I want to go from that member out on a range. I want to return everything at a given level. I want to return everything below a certain portion to a certain generation. I want to reference another cube. I want to write to another cube. I want to clear data. I want to calc data. All that in those 27 commands. I will talk just briefly on block creation. There are times when you want it to operate on things that don't exist. So let's say your scenario dimension is sparse, which it will be, for instance, in FCCS. So actual exists, but budget does not. Well, if you go run a command that looks like that one, and say if budget is greater than 100, actual equals 50, if one or the other of those blocks existed, it's not going to create the other one. So for instance, if budget is greater than 100, you might want it to go create actuals and put 50 out there. Actual is a different block. That block doesn't exist. It's not going to operate on it. So we have to make sure that our blocks are actually existing. And it does this for a reason, by the way. Like, why doesn't it just create every possible intersection? It would lead to a massive database explosion. Not literally, it doesn't blow up. But the size of volumes would go up to gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes by the time you're done. So we want it to not operate on every potential combination. We want it to focus just on the existing ones. So there are several ways to create blocks out there. The easiest way is if you just load data. You know, if you're loading it through SmartView or a data load, it doesn't only load data to the existing spots. Otherwise, the cube would never get loaded. So it's going to go load up anything you try and load a number to. There are also ways, if you calculate and aggregate the database, it will make the upper level blocks for you. One of the really quick ways is the data copy command. If I had run that thing and I said copy budget to actual or copy actual to budget, it will create the new blocks as it goes across. There are some more complicated ways to do it. One of the newer fun ways is with the create block function. I would love to walk you through all this, but we have 12 minutes left. This is the only commercial slide I will give you in the whole thing, and it's the world's fastest commercial slide. By the way, that is a shameless plug. He's flashing us. I do a 2-day Calc script class for mere mortals. I do it sometimes. Glenn does it. A few other people at Interrel do it. We don't hold it a ton. It's actually been getting more and more infrequent, but so many people have asked me about Calc scripts here. We're going to hold another one. If you want to go, just shoot an email over to info@interrel.com and say you want to go. We'll invite you to the next public one. By the way, we train a ton of our competitors. Feel free to attend that. So customers, competitors, Oracle, the FCCS development team, please go to info@interrel.com. So I'm going to jump from slide 53 all the way down. By the way, in the full deck, I give you some really detailed examples on like how to use fix, how to use if. For instance, you know, I say, here's how you focus on west, here's how you focus on west, south, and actual, here's how you use a function inside of a fix. All of these are on those videos. So epm.bi/videos, just go out there, look for fix. I've got another one out there where I talk all the way through how to use if. I've got a video out there on how to use isMember, which is one of those 27 really important things you should learn to figure out which member you're actually on. So as you can see, no marketing, have a ball, go out to those. I do want to talk about FCCS and PBCS, and if I don't make it through all this, don't worry, it's in the deck. You'll get bonus information. The thing about FCCS, ePBCS is people say, well, wait a second, everything is already pre-calculated for me. They have all these awesome out-of-the-box calculations. That's why I paid for it. Well, that's true. You're getting things like consolidating of your application, translating of your data, clearing out various portions that it doesn't need, computing various rates, getting in information out of Supplemental Data Manager. A lot of those are pre-built for you. So when you actually go out and look at the rules, you will see a series of existing ones. What we need to do is, in certain cases, customize. Maybe we don't want it to operate on the whole application. Maybe we want to do a certain type of aggregation. Maybe we have calculations unique to our company, and we don't want to be caught up in that box. Well, if you're wondering why it took a year and a half for them to expose custom calculations, quite simply, it's because they wanted to add more in the box. They wanted to find out what people wanted to custom write, and then go build it out there. But there are definitely times when I need to customize. So we're going to go up to consolidation. We're going to pull up a specific rule. We're going to right-click on it, and generally the ones that we want to go into are the ones that have a little person next to them. Those are our custom calculations. So you see, for instance, there's a custom calculation that runs after the opening balance have been carried forward. There's also a custom calculation that runs as a final calc as part of the application. So without going into detail, there are kind of three major groups of calculations. One are things happening on local currency. One are things happening on your translated data. One are things happening on your consolidated and fully eliminated data all the way up. Now, when you're running each one of these, it's going to do some limiting of areas you're allowed to calculate. For instance, if you're on a local currency calculation, it's automatically going to restrict you to the entity currency. It's not going to let you wander off into some other currencies that already translated information. On the other hand, once you get over into translated, it's going to instead focus on the parent currency. So when we're in FCCS or we're in PBCS, it's smart enough to know to actually go to the translated information. What if we want the consolidated information? Well, the members it's going to handily be focused on are my parent currency at the already eliminated value. So if we look at those local currency calculations, you can see each one of those is kind of a tab. So I can click on local, and that's these, translated as those, consolidated as those. So within local currency, I'm mostly going to be editing the after opening balance carry forward. By the way, I can go fiddle around with the other ones, but they're going to be more kind of template driven. So I'm going to kind of skip the template driven portion of all these and jump over to this fascinating slide. Here's my custom portions. So over on consolidated, we can fiddle around with after opening balance carry forward, and we can do kind of our final calculation before everything is done except the ratios. So basically after all the data has been consolidated, after it's all been eliminated. So here's how I get to it. From FCCS, I'm just going to double click on one of those calculations that I like. It's going to open up, and I mentioned this at the very beginning, inside of planning, inside of Calculation Manager. So they always appear under there until they finally fix that. Also, it handily not only takes you to planning, it forgets what you just double clicked on. It's going to go over into Calculation Manager, at least at the moment. It's going to show you all the calcs that are out there that you can edit. So I'm going to go double click on one of those. Now there are limitations on what you can focus on because some things are already focused. For instance, it already knows exactly what scenario you're calculating. When you run it, it knows what year you're on, it knows what period, it knows what view, it knows what entities you're able to look at. So you don't ever have to worry about, for instance, calculating something that's locked, changing those numbers, because it will already lock you out of it. That's not a valid scenario year period combination you could actually select. There are also some limitations, not just on which dimensions that it's going to provide. There are also various members in the accounts dimension it will not let you calculate. These are things that it controls. The list is remarkably long, but so you don't have to find it. I went and pasted it in. There are also limitations on the data source dimension and the movement dimension. Those are all fully in the documentation. So wait a second, Edward. That is a whole lot of accounts I can't calculate. How do I tell it I want to do all the accounts that are out there except for the system accounts, the drivers, the ratios, and the exchange rates, which is essentially that whole list? Well, at this point, we're going to have to use some of those functions. Now, this is kind of an advanced topic, so I'm just going to tell you the answer. So we're going to use a fix, and in our fix, we're going to say take all the bottom levels of the accounts dimension, and from all of the accounts that are out there, remove the ones I'm not allowed to work on. So this is a function inside of a function, inside of a command. Ooh. So we have the fix. So we're going to start by saying, if kind of go from the inside out. So it's a fix, so we're going to limit down our calculation. So the inside, lev members account 0, says go to the account dimension, the first argument's a dimension, go to 0, meaning the bottom level of it. And we're going to remove something from that list. So the first parameter of the remove command is what we want to start with. The next command is a list of members we want to remove. But we don't just want to remove the FCCS system accounts and everything beneath it. We want to remove a whole list of things. So relative is inside of the list along with various other members. Finally, I'm concluding the list. So this is the list I want to remove from the whole account list, a closing parenthesis for the remove, and a closing parenthesis for the fix. So if you look at it, now that I explained it, it's a little easier to see, right? Levels, that's what I start with, and then what portions I want to take out. Now I could do stuff to the accounts I'm actually allowed to fiddle with. There is also at this moment a remarkably, even bafflingly long list of functions you are not allowed to use. Some of them make absolutely no sense. They're like integer functions, like log functions. A lot of the mathematical functions aren't actually supported. This is the current list, so here's the link. Snap a picture, you'll get it in the full deck. Or just Google supported Essbase functions and financial close and consolidation, you'll get this list. I pulled this up this morning at about 12:15 a.m. Of those 224 commands that are available to you in Essbase, 114 are not actually supported. The list is remarkably long, includes most of the math functions, most of the stat functions, which I'm still confused by, most of the financial functions, and just because I was bored in the middle of the night, I pasted them all into a slide. So you don't have to go out there. You will always forever remember, thank you for sharing this information with us. But you'll see things like exponent, growth, factorial, integer, log, the max function doesn't work inside. Some of them make sense. The set commands, some of the calc commands, like you can't do a calc all because you're limiting on dimensions. I get that. I get why they don't want me fiddling with the set commands because there are probably already some predefined ones in FCCS. Here's my opinion. I do not work for Oracle Product Management. This is just my speculation. It will eventually support a ton of those functions. It may or may not support a lot more of the command side, but a lot of those functions are coming in. This is a pretty new feature, the ability to do these custom calculations. I think it dates back to, was it December? I think when it first showed up officially. So it's going to be filled in. PBCS, you don't have nearly the amount of restrictions. For instance, in PBCS, pretty much what you're getting is outline consolidation. Do the rest yourself. Go write all your own formulas, go write all your own calculations, have a ball, do whatever you want. It's meant to be a framework. ePBCS, or the +1 after PBCS +1, has a ton of stuff pre-built, including various formulas, various frameworks, various accounts, various member combinations. In the full slide deck, I've handily explained for each one of the frameworks. This is great for you consultants in the room. Give me 5s for telling you this. These are kind of the main sections that are pre-calculated for you. I do the same thing I'll show you the workforce framework, that's out there too. I also tossed it in for benefits. I give you some examples of the wizards. At the end of the day, you can actually customize in a lot of cases the out-of-the-box rules. If you do, you're essentially avoiding your warranty. At that point, Oracle's like, no longer my problem. Now, officially, they are doing that because they don't want to overwrite your custom logic, and that's probably true. You customize a formula, and the first Friday of each month, all of a sudden it disappears. You get really, really irritated. So in most cases, if you're going to edit an out-of-the-box rule, you're probably going to copy it across. You're going to either create a rule from scratch, or you're going to take that copy where you saved an out-of-the-box ones, you're going to edit it. You can then take a rule set and say, I want to use your existing out-of-the-box with my kind of own little customized portion. Try and use as much as possible the system members that are in there. Like anything that starts, for instance, in FCCS with FCCS underscore is basically guaranteed to be there from version to version. So whenever you reference those members in a calculation, those members will continue to be there. So anytime it starts with one of the all caps, and it varies app to app, one of the all caps followed by an underscore, do calcs based on those, and they will carry across. So we are going to jump all the way down to slide 98. So generally, the EPM cloud applications are built on Essbase. And when I say most, there are some things it has to store relationally. For instance, supporting detail, workflow information, usernames, groups, that kind of thing. But if it is a number and it has hierarchy to it, it's going to be going out and putting it inside of an Essbase cube. You can build a cube without knowing your Essbase fundamentals. You will generally build a very slow application when you're building PBCS or FCCS, and it's very difficult to customize it if you don't. There are some wizards that it gives you to work through, but if you know your Essbase fundamentals, it's really going to help you grow, it's going to help you enhance, it's going to make your customers a lot happier. You are going to have to think through when something should be a formula, when it should be a business rule, and really focus on performance. It's also a really good idea to know when you're avoiding your warranty and when you aren't. If you stick, for instance, in FCCS to everything with a little people icon, you're within your warranty constraints. That's a kind of an add-on area. Wow, this is a ton of information. My mind is blown. If I could give you more than 5 stars, I probably would. Where do I go next? I'll give you a free place to go. Go to epm.bi/videos. Like I said, I've got stuff on all kinds of calcs. I never thought anybody would view them. Like, for instance, my @isGen function, I think has 19 views. You could be number 20 out there on that video. If you want to buy a book, I think they're about to close downstairs, but they have this wonderful OAC book out there. I've got a chapter in my Essbase book and a chapter in my planning book that also talks calculations. So if you're an FCCS person, like I want to understand more about Essbase, you can either buy that OAC book or buy the Essbase book down below. If you do want to learn some more about these custom calculations, I don't do this very often, but we are actually doing a PBCS class, a public class. It's based on our PBCS book. If you want to register, shoot something over to info@interrel.com. I know that was a ton of information, and believe it or not, we are at exactly 1 hour. So do me one last favor. If you've enjoyed this presentation, if you haven't fallen asleep, if you've learned at least one thing, if you feel this was in the top 20% of sessions you've attended at Kscope, feel free to fill in 5s. If you don't think it's worth that, circle some other number and explain how we could get into that top 20%. This is my final presentation at this entire conference, so I'm really happy that all 7,000 of you came out for this entire session. I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks, everybody. Have an awesome rest of Kscope.